Was this real-life Canadian serial killer the inspiration for horror villain Freddy Krueger? Many have pointed out the parallels between Canadian serial killer David Krueger with the horror film character Freddy Krueger. For those of you who don't know, Freddy Krueger is a character who, in Wes Craven's original script, was a child predator who was caught and burned alive by angry parents. After resurrecting from the dead, Freddy began to slaughter the children of Springwood in their dreams. Wes Craven said that his inspiration for Freddy Krueger's power stemmed from several stories in the Los Angeles Times about a series of mysterious deaths. All the victims had reported recurring nightmares and died in their sleep. And serial killer Peter Woodcock, who later changed his name to David Krueger, also targeted children. On September 15, 1956, 17-year-old David Krueger was riding his bike around the grounds of Exhibition Place when he met 7-year-old Wayne Mallett. He lured the boy out of sight and then proceeded to strangle him to death. Mallett's body was found in the early hours of September 16th. It appeared that his clothing had been removed and that he had been redressed. His face was pushed into the dirt and 2 bite marks were found on his body. One on the boy's calf and the other in an area I'm not going to say. Pennies were found scattered around where the body was laying, and Krueger had defecated next to the body as well. On October 6, 1956, Krueger was riding his bike around Cabbagetown when he picked up a 9-year-old Gary Morris. He then took the boy to Cherry Beach, where he strangled him and beat him to death, with the coroner later determining that he had died from a ruptured liver. Morris was found with bite marks on his throat, and this time paper clips were ritualistically scattered around the corpse. Again, clothing had been taken off the victim, and the victim had then been redressed. 2 months later, on January 19, 1957, Krueger was riding his bike around when he approached a 4-year-old Carol Boyce. He offered her a ride and then rode her under a bridge and murdered her. When she was found, her clothes had been pulled off. It appeared that she had been choked into unconsciousness and then SA'd. Her eyes had been gouged out, and her death was caused by a large tree branch being forcibly inserted inside of her. Witnesses nearby who saw Krueger ride away on his bike made sketches for police, and he was subsequently arrested. Upon his arrest, Krueger led police to 11 other locations where he had allegedly SA'd other children. Both Freddy Krueger and David Krueger were adopted. Freddy had an abusive, alcoholic adoptive father. His mother, Amanda, was a nun who worked in a psychiatric hospital and was SA'd by, quote, over 100 psychopaths becoming impregnated, pointing a finger at genetic predisposition. David Krueger was also adopted after being born to a 17-year-old factory worker. The first 3 years of his life, bouncing around from one foster family, he experienced feeding problems and cried constantly. By his first birthday, he became terrified of anybody approaching him, and his speech was incoherent, described as strange, whining animal sounds. In at least one of these homes, when he was 2 years old, he was so badly beaten that he arrived at a hospital emergency ward with a twisted neck. David therefore showed signs, unsurprisingly, of severe emotional trauma by the time he found a permanent foster home at age 3. At age 5, Krueger remained socially maladjusted and became the target of neighborhood bullies. He was observed by his parents as being an aimless wanderer. When asked about it, he attributed his wandering to feeling so nervous that he had to get away. David was eventually sent to a private school, but remained isolated and did not make any friends. By age 11, he was described as angry, and his violent fantasies at this time were present. When a social worker was walking with Krueger through the Canadian National Exhibition, he muttered, quote, "I wish a bomb would fall on the exhibition and murder all the children." Krueger was then sent to a school for emotionally disturbed children in Kingston, Ontario, and began acting on his strong sexual urges. When he turned 15, he was discharged and returned to live with his foster parents. At this point, he re-enrolled in private school where he was relentlessly bullied. At 16, he left the private school, re-enrolled in the public school, but upon entering was immediately recognized and bullied mercilessly by the kids there. He transferred back to the private school 6 weeks later. Though the horrific bullying by his peers continued, his teachers remembered him as a very bright student who excelled in history and science and various other subjects, frequently scoring 100% on all of his tests. And Krueger's prized possession was his red and white Schwinn bicycle, which he would ride through the far reaches of the city, even during the coldest of winters. His fantasy world involved leading a gang of 500 invisible children on bikes called the Winchester Heights Gang. His foster parents were aware of his fantasy world and his compulsion to wander, but they had no idea he had been traveling around Toronto and SAing children in the neighborhood. Upon Upon his arrest after murdering 4-year-old Carol Voice, Krueger recalled, "My fear was that Mother would find out. Mother was my biggest fear. I didn't know if the police would let her at me." After a 4-day trial, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sent to the Oak Ridge Division of the Maximum Security Mental Hospital. Here, he underwent various forms of psychiatric therapy, including LSD treatments, which were popular in Canada in the 1960s. He was also given other personality-breaking drugs. He participated in something called the 100-Day Hate-In, where individuals deemed psychopathic were all jammed into a room together and forced to learn empathy. Krueger was also given strong hallucinogenics and locked into a large artificial womb of solitary confinement for several days. He did not respond well to these treatments. He also engaged in sexual acts with his fellow inmates, who were often considered less intelligent and less sane than he was. Krueger was later transferred to less restrictive institutions, eventually arriving at the Brockville Psychiatric Hospital. Staff indulged his passion for trains by taking him to the Smiths Falls Railway Museum. They also took him to see the movie The Silence of the Lambs. During this time, Krueger had rekindled a relationship with a man named Bruce Hamill, an Ottawa killer who had recently been released and was working as a security guard. Bruce had recently stopped taking his medications and had a perpetual wide-eyed look. Krueger convinced Hamill that he'd be able to join the Alien Brotherhood with a $50,000 bonus, and that his brain problems would be cured if he helped kill another Brockville inmate named Dennis Kerr. Krueger allegedly had a problem with Dennis, as Dennis had allegedly turned down his sexual advances. So on July 13th, 1991, Bruce went to a hardware store, bought a plumber's wrench, hatchet, knives, a sleeping bag, then went to the Brockville Hospital and signed out David on his first ever publicly escorted day pass. The two were supposed to go for ice cream. Krueger and Hamill then hid in the bushes and waited for Kerr's arrival. They then lured him to a secluded spot and beat him into unconsciousnness. They then hacked and stabbed Kerr, mutilating his entire body, nearly severing his head and repeatedly SAing the corpse. Hamill then took a handful of over-the-counter sleeping pills and waited for the aliens to come. Krueger, on the other hand, went to the police and confessed. He was then sent back to Brockville, where he spent the remainder 18 years of his life. He had no family. His death was reported to his lawyer by another serial killer. In his careful, soft-spoken voice, David Krueger sometimes tried to explain why he killed, but never came up with rational reasons. Most serial killers report having no idea why they kill, often because many of the real reasons have to do with boundary violations during times that are repressed when they were pre-verbal. And most serial killers come to view systems through very similar lenses: stupid and corrupt because no one's paying attention. This view often begins with their family systems, of course, and then bleeds into subsequent systems like school, work, mental hospitals, or prisons. In one of his final interviews in 1993, David Krueger said, "I'm accused of having no morality, which is a fair assessment, because my morality is whatever the system allows." Feel free to leave a comment about this incredibly disturbing case.